Thank you. So I am Ashley Smart. I am the Associate Director for the Night Science Journalism Program and also a Senior Editor at Undark, both located at that other school in Cambridge. So it's always tough to follow lunch, but I think we have an outstanding panel here. So I think if anyone can do it, it's this group of gentlemen here. As I mentioned, I work at Undark, which is a digital science magazine. We focus really on covering the intersection of science and society, the places where science and society clash. And partly for that reason, I'm completely in love with the topic of this upcoming discussion, climate science through a community lens. It really represents maybe the area where, this massive body of science that we've produced about climate change collides with society and people's everyday lives. And when we look at climate change through this lens, things stop being so abstract and distant, and they start becoming very tangible, very immediate, very urgent. It's no longer sea level rise, it's flooding, or it's water quality. It's no longer global temperature trends, it's heat waves and drought. And I think also increasingly, we're seeing that a lot of the innovative solutions to climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, are coming from this community's level, states, cities, and even neighborhoods. And our three panelists today have a wealth of experience on all those fronts. So we're very pleased to have them here today. I'll start with my left and introduce Peter Shumlin. Governor Shumlin was a 3-term governor of Vermont, and prior to that, a many-term state senator in Vermont. Most recently was a Menschel Senior Fellow here at Harvard. Welcome, Governor Shumlin.
Thanks so much.
To his left is Chris Wheat. Chris Wheat works with the National Resource Defense Council, where he is Director of Strategy and City Engagement for the American Cities Climate Challenge. Chris worked for several years in the office of Mayor Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, serving both as Chief Sustainability Officer and Chief of Policy. Welcome, Chris. Thanks. And then last but certainly not least, Elliot Diringer is Executive Vice President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, also served as a policy advisor and Director of Communications in the Clinton administration, and is also an award-winning journalist, formerly of the San Francisco Chronicle. Welcome, Elliot.
Great to be back at Lippman House, thanks.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and also a Nieman. Once a Nieman, always a Nieman, they say.
That's right.
Yeah. So we'll start off by hearing from the panelists about some of their experiences, and then toward the end, we'll open it up for Q&A with the audience. But Governor Shumlin, I'd like to start by hearing you tell us a little bit about your experience in Vermont. You were a 3-term governor of Vermont, and under your leadership, Vermont was really one of the more progressive states on this issue of climate change. I believe you established a climate cabinet even while you were there. Yeah. What were some of the challenges and also some of the successes that you experienced during your term as governor?
Well, thanks. And thanks for having me, by the way. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be here with a group of incredible journalists. And I want to thank you for your service at a time when, unprecedented in our history, you're under attack almost every day from the loudest voice in America, maybe the loudest voice in the world. So my sympathies, and I understand. I've been a governor, so I get it. So to answer Ashley's question, let me start at the beginning. When I ran for office in 2010, we were all running on jobs. You can remember bottom of the recession, Obama, John McCain, doesn't matter who, everyone's all over the world losing millions of jobs a week. There was every political person from every party. And one of the things I said about job creation was, if you elect me, we're going to shut down the aging nuclear power plant that we had, our major generator, which was leaking. It had just been relicensed by the NRC for another 40 years. And we're going to build out renewables like you've never seen before. And we're going to do wind, we're going to do solar, because I believe that that's cheaper than importing coal and oil from outside of Vermont, since we don't produce in Vermont. I said, we're going to do energy efficiency. We're going to turn our utilities into energy efficiency companies. And I said, when we do that, we're going to create jobs, because in any transformation in the economy, you create huge numbers of jobs. I said, second, we'll put money in Vermonters' pockets, because I believe that our rates will go down or at least be level, not up. I think it's cheaper. And third and finally, we'll show at least how one state can develop a green carbon footprint. So, and of course, my opponent, Republican opponent, said what you would expect. This guy's nuts. Don't vote for him. If he shuts down the nuclear power plant, you're going to lose thousands of jobs right there, which he was actually right about. Second, renewables are much more expensive than conventional ways of juicing our boxes, so forget that. And third, climate change it's a hoax anyway, so what's he talking about? So anyway, the good news was for me was that I won, and the bad news for him was that he didn't. So the first thing I did was pass a comprehensive energy bill that implemented the policies that outlined. I only give you that background because you got to remember, you all know this well as reporters, when you win an election, particularly the first one, you don't win by 40 points. It's always close. And about half the people don't agree with you. So I then was literally 6 months into office, got whacked by Hurricane Irene. It was the worst storm that has ever hit Vermont. To put it in short view, we got 21 inches of rain dumped on us in 3 hours. Now, you remember, Vermont is not Indiana. We are mountains into valleys, so when you get that kind of rain, all of a sudden, total devastation. You could not move from east to west in Vermont. Our highways were gone. We lost 7 good Vermonters who literally were next to little brooks that became raging rivers. We lost homes. We lost businesses. I mean, we were on our feet, knocked out, and it was August. So in Vermont in August, the difference between Vermont and Florida, for example, is that you can't spread pavement after it freezes. We had all these issues, so total and complete devastation. I'm only telling you all this because as painful as that storm was, a lot of my critics kind of went, hey, maybe this crazy guy's got a point. Like, what's going on here? It was actually the third storm we'd had like that in a short period of time. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, to give you the short story, I served 3 terms. I didn't run for a 4th. But by the time I was done, we were the #1 solar state in America, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. We created jobs, just like I told them. Today, if you have 17 Vermonters in a room, one of them works in the renewable energy business. That's a big deal. We took our unemployment rate from pretty high down to one of the lowest in America. It was a problem it got so low. I would argue it's a problem now. Second, we put money in Vermonters' pockets. If you go look at our power rates when I was governor, for 3 of the 4 years I was governor, they went down. That means your bill got lower the year after year for 3 years. For 1 year, they were flat. So they didn't go up. If you go look at New Hampshire, they saw 50%, 100% from some utilities while I was governor, live free or die, but pay more. Massachusetts saw increases, huge. Connecticut saw huge increases, New York State. So anyway, to give you the short version, we put money in Vermonters' pockets. Most importantly, we've over time turned our utilities into energy efficiency companies, and we can talk more about that later. So what are the lessons? The lessons were, if you put in the right policies, and we can talk about that later in the panel, you can make huge change. Is it as complicated as we make it out? No, it's actually pretty damn easy. Why don't we do it? What was my biggest problem and lessons? It's hard to take on the moneyed interests. Second, change is really hard. Change is really hard. The guy who succeeded me, we increased wind, I said solar 11 times. So think of that. Every solar panel that were when I went in, there were 11 when we went out. Wind by 22 times. So for every windmill in Vermont, there were 22 when I left. That's in 6 years. So the governor who came after me in Vermont believed, despite our reputation of being Bernie state and, super blue, we're actually not when it comes to governors. Every time we switch governors, we don't throw our governors out. They just get sick of running every 2 years. So anyway, long and short of it is we go Republican, Democrat every time. So the Republican who replaced me, I replaced a Republican. I got replaced by a Republican. He will get replaced by, hopefully, a woman for a change, but a Democrat. Anyway, the long and short of it is, he ran on a platform that we will do a wind moratorium if you elect me governor. That's how unpopular my renewable energy was by the time I left. So
congrats.
That's a challenge. Yeah. All right. End of story. Does that help? Give you a little background?
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
And so from the state level to the city level, Chris, you spent 7 years, I believe, in working in Rahm Emanuel's mayoral office. What are some of the successes that you were able to have, taking on climate change from City Hall, so to speak?
Yeah, and thanks to Nieman for having us. I also want to thank Sea Change, Sky Flanagan, and the staff over there. As an employee of NRDC, sorry about taking your boss. But
I'm surprised they let you on this.
yeah,
station,
well, they scheduled me before that happened. So I think about this not only context as an ex-City Hall staffer, but also in the work I do today with the American Cities Climate Challenge, which works with 25 cities around the country to accelerate climate change policies, programs, and investments in cities around the U.S. And I think that the reason that the solutions piece at the local level is so important is for a few different reasons. One, it frankly avoids the nihilism that gets created in these conversations. And I know that was part of the conversation this morning, that the problem seems so great every time there's an IPCC report. That it becomes a situation where honestly people don't feel like they can do anything about it. And as one of my colleagues says, nihilism, there's not much of a difference between nihilism and denialism. Because if you can't do anything about it, then I'm not going to do anything about it. Or that we move the conversation to a level of personal shame. That I'm not doing a good enough, I'm not vegan, and I'm not doing consignment, and because of that, I am not doing my role as it comes to this movement. I'm sure many of you saw the piece from my colleague Mary Hegler about saying, I'm in the environmental movement and I don't care if you recycle. With her point being, she cares if you recycle, but. Her point being is that how do we think about large transformational change? And often those local solutions, the ability to move city councils, the ability to move mayors, create practical solutions to the issue at hand. I think that's a second reason I enjoy the city work so much is that this has to be that the work around climate change, be it expansion of electric vehicles infrastructure, retrofitting city buildings, promoting energy benchmarking and disclosure, has to be balanced with the fact that mayors and city councils, they still got to pick up the trash every day. That they still got to go fill potholes, that they got to provide those basic services. And so the solutions, and I think the curve has shifted a little bit in this. I think in 2017, at the city and state level, you couldn't throw a stick without hitting another commitment or another declaration. And I wrote some of those. And I think what you've seen, particularly in the last 12 to 18 months, that there's been a higher shift on what do those things actually mean. And you're starting to see cities actually doing things like investing in bike and bus infrastructure, because you got to give people reliable options to get out of cars if you want to do something about it. And so I think that you're seeing more and more practical solutions. The third reason I think the work is interesting is because the framing often has to be outside the environment. From a political standpoint, I've always called issues around climate change and environment, they're roughly equivalent to hockey, in that sometimes people are really interested, and then the rest of the time you have a core group of people who are really interested and involved, and everyone else is kind of, eh. So for like NHL fans, like sometimes the Blackhawks are in the Stanley Cup Finals, and then sometimes they're not in the playoffs. And so for mayors, for sustainability directors, for city managers to care a lot about this work, there has to be a broader framing in this work, because frankly, mayors we watch a lot of mayoral races around the country. There was only one major mayoral race I saw in 2019 where climate change was an actual issue, and that was in San Antonio. But if you look in Chicago, in my hometown, if you look in Philadelphia, look in other places, these often aren't issues. Where the rubber meets the road is that we talk about transit. And so you are seeing that manifest in places like Cincinnati and Charlotte. How are we actually providing reliable transit to all residents and not just in downtown cores? they're talking about it in the context of job training programs, particularly for returning citizens, and how we're thinking about these programs in a just transition, because there are communities in Ohio, there are communities in places like Southern California, where people are still employed by the natural gas industry. And so what are we doing for those employees and those workers at the same time? And so the necessity to speak to issues of equity, the necessity to speak to issues of economic development, the necessity of speaking to these issues of public health, and getting past climate change becomes paramount in those discussions. When I worked in City Hall, we almost never did an environmental announcement that didn't have a job number connected to it. We figured out what the economic impact was, because that is what started making it more tangible and more real to residents. And also, it was a better framing device, frankly, as we talked to journalists.
Governor Shumlin, you mentioned the challenge of taking on the moneyed interest. I think we often kind of cast businesses as the villain in this climate change narrative. Elliot, you're in a position where you're working with the private sector to come up with solutions. What are some of the roles that you think the private sector can play in?
Thanks, Ashley, and I'll start with a disclaimer. I don't speak for companies. I don't represent companies. Turns out the only private sector jobs I've ever held since college have been with newspapers. But we do, in fact, work very closely with companies because, frankly, we don't think you can solve this problem without them. And a big part of our mission at C2ES is engaging companies in the climate policy process. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, we took out full-page ads with companies signing on, encouraging President Trump to stay in the Paris Agreement. We ran those ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. We also were advised to run them in the New York Post on the theory that that was the newspaper he read. Turns out it didn't help, as we know.
You forgot Fox.
We forgot, yeah. Well, we couldn't afford their rates, I guess. But a more recent example, just a couple of days ago, actually, we released this report. This is a very comprehensive policy agenda, Getting to Zero, a U.S. climate agenda. It lays out a whole raft of policies, all aimed at getting us to carbon neutrality in 2050. This is something that we developed over the course of the past year in consultation with 2 or 3 dozen companies. And a lot of companies participated with us in the release of that at an event in Washington a couple of days ago. And we got a story, right, in Newsweek that says corporate leaders promote plan to become carbon neutral by 2050. That's exactly the sort of thing we were working for. So that's the reason we engage with companies and the way that we engage with companies. I want to sort of step back a little bit, though, and set my comments in the context, the broader context of where I think we are with this issue and the role of the press generally on this issue. I mean, it's no original observation that we are in hyper-polarized times. And I think that, unfortunately, climate has become something of a proxy issue in that deepening political divide. And I think, as a consequence, there's some risk of the issue slipping into sort of like a permanent divide status, like we see on other issues in this country, where basically we're at a state of policy paralysis and don't make any progress. And we can't afford that on this issue, not just because it's important to us here what the U.S. does, but frankly, it's important globally what the U.S. does. And unless we really engage and demonstrate some leadership, I don't think we're going to tackle this problem at the global level either. So I think that the only effective policy to address this issue has to be a durable policy, which to me, given my time in Washington, suggests that it needs to have some bipartisan buy-in, right? This is not something that can be done on a partisan basis. So the lens that I look at this through is what is going to help establish the conditions for bridging the divide and making progress. Now, back when I was a reporter, I guess I was somewhat old school. I kind of viewed my role as being the neutral observer and providing a balanced and accurate account. And I can certainly understand, given the gravity and urgency of the climate challenge, why why you might be tempted to kind of revisit those traditional norms. So I think, it's important for all of you to be asking yourself, what is your role, right? Is it to inform? Is it to alert, persuade? Is it to galvanize? Is it to hold power accountable? Is it to expose? And I think it to some degree, it's all of those things, but we need to know where on that spectrum we really sit, and how much should you be thinking about the consequences of how you report on this issue. I mean, I think there was a time when we just felt like, well, we just write the facts and the chips fall where they may. But I don't think we can afford to take that kind of approach anymore. So, for me, it's really about trying to facilitate the understanding and dialogue that gets us to solutions. And I think there are some deeply ingrained habits in journalism that serve more to sort of reinforce than to help overcome the divisions. I say we, but it's really you. We gravitate toward drama. We gravitate toward conflict. We like to identify villains. And I think increasingly there's a tendency to sort of adopt or play to narratives that may not actually be helpful in moving the conversation forward, and they may resonate with a particular audience, but I don't know that they're moving us in the right direction. So in terms of the role of business, I view companies not so much as an enemy, but as a potential ally, because as I said, we're not going to get the job done without them. And I accept that in one way or another, they're probably all bad actors, right? But that can't disqualify them from engaging, because we need their capital. We need their ingenuity. We need their political support, particularly with the Republican side of the divide there. And frankly, every time we get companies out there talking about this issue, recognizing the issue, saying what they're going to do to address the issue, is a validation of the reality and urgency of climate change. So I think it's important and great that you've got lots of NGOs out there bashing the corporate world, but some of us also need to be engaging with them. So a few things that I see happening is that companies are understanding the issue, they're feeling enormous pressure to address the issue, and they are responding. They are experiencing the impacts of climate change, whether it's disrupting their supply chains or what have you. They are experiencing the actual physical impacts. They're under pressure from investors. They're under pressure from their consumers. They're under pressure from their employees. You see that certainly over at Google. They're under pressure from their prospective employees. That this is what they tell me, that when they're trying to hire talent, that's something that the talent has in mind. Where are you on climate change? One of the ways they respond is through disclosure. There's been a lot of pressure on companies to disclose the climate risks they face and how they're addressing those. And you can find reams of information that they've filed out there. The other thing I see happening is companies publicly committing to some very ambitious goals. Not long ago, Duke Energy, one of the largest power companies in the country and one of the largest carbon polluters in the country, publicly declared a goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Now, beyond the local press down in Charlotte and the trade press, that didn't really, get noticed very much. But I think that's actually a huge step, and they're not the only ones doing that. Another thing that I don't think has really gotten much attention is the shift that I see underway within the major trade associations. The Chamber of Commerce historically was, high on the list of obstacles to climate action. But they have been facing pressure from their own members to take a more reasoned view on this. And they've put out a statement that, doesn't quite go far enough, but there's nothing in that statement that I could disagree with. And, I mean, it could have been written by an NGO. At the bottom, it says, inaction is not an option. This is a sea change for the Chamber of Commerce, and it's a result of pressure from inside. I also see companies resisting Trump's rollbacks of regulation, whether it's the Clean Power Plan, the methane regulations, or the vehicle standards. There have all been companies saying, no, we don't really think that's a good idea. We think those should stay in place. And you also see companies more and more proactively advocating that they be regulated, that going up on the Hill, advocating for a carbon price, joining us in developing a report like this. I personally know oil company lobbyists who are on the Hill every day lobbying for a carbon price. And that kind of runs counter to the narrative we're all familiar with, but it's a reality. We're part of a coalition called the CEO Climate Dialogue, a group of NGOs and a bunch of companies, and several of them had CEOs up on the Hill over the last couple of weeks, again, making the case for carbon pricing. So, my thoughts on what that all means for those of you reporting the issue, I would very strongly encourage you to all be skeptical, right? But not just of the companies, but frankly, of everyone who's playing on the issue. Obviously, it's important to continue holding companies accountable. But I think we need to move beyond just the question of who knew what when, right? And punishing bad action. You got to, look at something like Duke's announcement and say, okay, you put yourself out there, you put yourself on the hook. How are you going to do that? And keep hammering at them until they come up with the right answers. Because frankly, they don't yet know how they're going to meet that goal. I think you can't always assume that companies are on the wrong side, and I think you need to be mindful of how your reporting may unwittingly reinforce narratives that are unhelpful and sometimes untruthful, and be open to stories that don't fit the narrative. I think it's always easy to find the industry voice, right, that's going to oppose climate action. And I see the same people quoted over and over again as the industry voice. But the industry isn't a monolith, and you can find other voices. It's harder to find them, but they're there. And I also wouldn't always assume that the advocates have the right answers. One version of the Green New Deal is 100% renewable energy by 2030. I don't know any credible analysis that suggests that that is possible. So, like I said, be skeptical all around. And, we've heard a lot, starting last night, about focusing on solutions. I really want to underscore that. I think the press is doing an incredibly great job documenting the problem. And don't let up on that. I think, we heard this morning about the polling. The public is getting it. They're connecting the dots. But we've also heard that they need hope, which means we need to focus on solutions. And, companies themselves are investing in the kinds of solutions that they think they can make money off of. So look at those investments, which is a way of getting at solutions. And, finally, I think it's important just to think hard about the interest you're trying to serve. It's my job to advance an agenda. Is that your job? Are you helping in the way you're reporting an issue? Are you helping to overcome the divide, or are you, maybe unwittingly helping to reinforce that divide? And are you, like I said before, are you helping to establish the conditions for making the kind of progress we need? So I'll leave it there.
So Elliot, you brought up several points that I think are really interesting, and I'd like to follow up on. I like that you mentioned this pitfall of falling back on the easy narrative or falling back on the easy story. I think there are certain types of climate stories that get a lot of coverage by us journalists. When the big reports come out, we're on that. The disaster stories, we're on those. I think from the three of you, do you see other stories that journalists just aren't covering well, stories that we're missing, whether it be stories about solutions or stories about impacts? And so I pose the question to the three of you. Chris, I'm kind of especially interested in your take, with the level at municipal government experience that you've had.
Sure. I think that particularly at the local level, and I wouldn't put this just on journalists. I think that the dots across the board, and this includes our mayors, we're not connecting the dots as it pertains to transportation. And transportation there's a reason that as a part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, we focus on buildings and energy and transportation. That's it. We don't focus on waste. We don't focus on adaptation. We are a mitigation program that focuses on those two issues. And transportation in most major cities is going to make up anywhere between 25 and 80% of the emissions that happen in a city. And so the way and it's a pretty simple calculation. Emissions, like, at its essence, climate emissions calculations are pretty easy. What's the fuel efficiency of the car that you're in? And you multiply it by the number of miles you drive the car. So you got to fix one of them. The federal government's been very clear about the former, and that they have zero interest in doing that, although, pressure from many of the major auto manufacturers is keeping that discussion alive, and you're seeing states trying to be proactive on that issue. So how do we reduce the number of vehicles miles traveled, VMT? And so there are a lot of different ways of doing that. You can do it through the push on electric vehicles. So doing things like mandating more electric vehicle infrastructure. You can do it by investing in transit. You can do it by creating safety measures around pedestrian traffic and bicycling traffic. Most major cities have a Vision Zero plan. And we talk about it often in terms of pedestrian safety, and unfortunately, almost every major city in America has had a major tragedy as it comes to a cyclist or a pedestrian, but it's also a climate change issue, because if I'm walking or if I'm taking a bike, I'm not in a car. And also, how are we thinking about the investments that we're making in transit, particularly as it becomes to bus? We spent a lot of time focused on putting investments in bus because it is really freaking expensive to build a rail line. And so bus is actually one of the fastest ways to establish capacity, change roads, and actually change people's mindset. So I think, in particular, the role that transit and transportation plays is critical.
And I know Miranda's got her question and answer thing up, but I just want to give you my perspective on your question. I think it's really easy for the press to get hits when you, as Elliot suggested, report on the tragedy. And I got more press when we were all underwater in Vermont, and now I assume everybody's in Venice, and then we're going to be in California for the fires there, and then we're all keep moving around. I never had a reporter from outside of Vermont ask the question, how did you become #1 solar state in a really short period of time? How did you actually turn your utilities into energy efficiency companies from companies that just go buy juice and try to sell as much to customers? I've never had a national reporter ask that question, and I don't think that story's ever been written in America. So going to what Elliot said of, are you part of the problem or you're part of the solution, I would just say, dig a little deeper into what's working. You look at these presidential debates on almost every subject, including climate change. The level of discussion, considering that the world is burning up, the planet's on fire, time is up, we're all done here right now if we don't get moving really, really fast. It's just shocking to me that more people don't ask the question, okay, there's some stuff that's working in America. How? Why? What's working? It's not coming from the federal government. It's got to be coming from states and cities and communities, which is what this forum's about. What's working that's working? Like, how does the coldest state in America, one of them, become the #1 solar state in America? Why isn't Florida the solar state in America? I mean, by the way, you got a hell of a lot more sun than we do. We got a lot of clouds and cold. Come up here in November and see how much you like it, My point is, I think we love to get tantalized by pain. And our pain is so deep. Don't forget what's happening now is just a warning sign for what lies ahead. Just the carbon we've emitted in the last few weeks and years is going to be felt in 20 or 30. This is big stuff. The biggest stuff that humankind has ever faced. And I'm amazed that no one's asked me or anybody else, how did Vermont become the #1 solar state? How did they get their utilities to literally pay people for the excess power they produce? That's how we did it. We passed a law that said, for any extra generation from wind or solar that you produce, we will pay you what you would have paid. Not very hard. Totally transformed our energy grid. Even the greatest climate skeptics suddenly said, hey, Bertha, I don't believe in this bullshit about climate change, but Jesus Christ, let's get some of them solar panels up that farm because we can make a little money here, you know? Like, this isn't tough. If I were running for president, I'm not crazy enough to do it, there's only two things you have to do to fix our climate problem in America. It's not hard. Number one, do what Vermont did. I'm not kidding. If you passed a federal law that said, any excess juice that you produce, it's called national net metering, we will pay you for any extra juice what you would have paid. Utilities will all flip out, but they'll come around actually understanding it makes sense. And number two, going to what you were saying about transportation. Listen, I'm old enough to remember Los Angeles. Who's here from Los Angeles? When I was a kid, Los Angeles air was as bad as Beijing. It really was. So what happened? The federal government said, oh, wow, we can't breathe air in our cities. We got a problem. Let's put catalytic converters on cars. Do you think that the big three automakers were in Washington going, hey, could you force us to put catalytic converters on our cars? Now, you just saw in the press today, Mustang's about to go, we're going electric. Everyone's going electric. President Xi has told, as Trump pulls out a climate accord, big three, if you want to sell cars in China in 22, 23, guess what? We're all for it. We'd love to have your cars. They can't have a combustion engine in them. So you got, Henry Ford Jr. down there, or whatever he is. Who runs Ford now? One of those Fords. Scrambling to build EVs, a Mustang EV. Are you kidding me? All you got to do is do what Vermont did. Seriously. Net metering, and second, you say by 2023, 2024, I don't know, pick your year, sell the cars you want in America, but they got to be EVs. You do those two things, problem solved for America, the biggest energy hog in the world. I mean, I don't know why we don't ask more often what's working, what in communities is working, why do people support it? Because of jobs, because of economic expansion. That's why they supported it in Vermont, actually, because they can make money, but they're putting a little solar up on the roof and all the rest. I just don't think it's that tough. But I think we've got to dig a little deeper.
You heard it here, everyone. We have our climate solution. I want to open it up to the audience for questions, but first I want to sneak in one more of my own. Chris, you mentioned the issue of equity. We've seen time and time again examples of how it's often marginalized communities, low-income communities, that are most vulnerable to climate change, whether it's issues like climate gentrification in Miami, heat island effects being more pronounced in low-income neighborhoods. And also there's the risk that some of our climate solutions may exacerbate those inequalities. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that we don't leave those communities behind, and how do we do it?
So I think that the solutions and the responsibility, I would argue it often falls back on local communities. For a few different reasons. One, cities often are paying the cost of environmental racism through issues like public health, because there's more asthma cases in our city and county clinics. The impact it has particularly on senior citizens and what that does to social service programs, the inability for children to to reach their peak in terms of educational attainment because of issues of lead or air pollution. So cities will own the problem regardless, even if they don't come up with solutions. The other piece is that because these issues, I think, are manifesting themselves in very real ways, particularly issues of affordability. You talked about gentrification. All the polling we do speaks to the issue of affordability and income inequality of being the central issue in nearly every major city in America. The other reason I think that cities will be responsible for is because mayors will lose. Mayors will lose on this issue, and the issues of affordability and income inequality are manifesting themselves in every part of the country. I think that some cities are candidly better on these issues than others. I think some cities are beginning to slow down their processes in terms of how are we bringing more voices to the table. I think others they're actively trying to figure out how do they do more than just frankly provide a level of lip service. But I think it also, and I think this gets to storytelling as well, in terms of who is telling that story. NRDC has been fighting the environmental fight for over 40 years. But one of the questions we ask ourselves is, today, are we really the right sole voice in this issue? And so we make a concerted effort to think about environmental justice organizations, communities of color, organizations that frankly don't bill themselves as environmental organizations, but they're really sitting at the front lines of these discussions. And so when you have issues like the Green New Deal pop up, I think is a very fair argument whether or not from a policy solution standpoint it's feasible. But I also think that there is value in terms of how it is bringing more folks to the movement and how it's bringing more voices to the table and understanding the intersectionality of these problems, that it is not just about climate. One, because if it's just about climate, as I was saying earlier, you'll lose from a political standpoint. And if it's just about climate, you're going to miss the big picture. You're going to miss those coal workers in Southern Ohio and Southern Illinois that are being affected by this. You're going to create solutions. You're going to create potentially electric vehicle infrastructure that no one can afford that lives in communities. And if you look at things like transit and transportation, the issue of gentrification manifests itself in a real way. This is something I dealt with in the city of Chicago, is in Black and brown communities. Why are you putting bike lanes in my neighborhood? Because first it's the bike lanes, and then it's a soul cycle or whatever. And that's a good way of pricing communities out and ultimately building communities that not for us. So ultimately that's going to land at the feet of cities, and I think cities are working hard to develop solutions knowing they're not there yet.
Would you agree with that, Elliot?
I would. I mean, I think, climate change is an inequity amplifier. And this is true at the global level, at the national level, and at the local level. And the inequities take many different forms. I mean, the impacts obviously tend to fall on the most vulnerable. The solutions can be a burden on the most vulnerable as well. I mean, we have recommendations in here to make sure that you minimize any cost burden on low-income households, for instance. You put a price on carbon, well, that's going to be least affordable to those who can least afford it. So I think we need to be really mindful in the way that we construct climate policy, how to avoid exacerbating the existing inequities. I'm glad Chris mentioned the coal miners. I think that's a huge equity issue as well. Obviously, the coal industry has contributed heavily to the problem. I don't hold coal miners per se responsible for that, but they are suffering economically as we transition away from fossil fuels. They happen to have been economically dependent on a resource that we as a society valued and no longer value, and they're left high and dry. So we need to take care of that. Not only because I think that's part of it's a necessary ingredient for the political solution at the national level, but also because it just happens to be the right thing. So I think we really need to, across the board, understand the ways in which equity plays into this and address those issues. At the same time, I don't know that we can look to climate solutions to address all the inequities in society. And I think I appreciate the governor's analysis that this is an easy problem to solve, and I'm glad that in Vermont you had all that success. I think to get us to carbon neutrality by 2050 or whenever is going to be tough. And getting the political consensus we need to do the things that will get us there is going to be tough. But if we align that agenda with other agendas, basically a remaking of our capitalist society, I think it's going to be harder to get the buy-in, the political buy-in. It may bring some more people to it, but those are people who are with us already for the most part. I'm worried about the people who aren't with us yet. How do we get them on board with addressing the climate challenge? I think we need to. So I think we need to. We need to be mindful of and try to design against exacerbating inequities. But I worry about taking on all the inequities in our society.
I agree with that, but I want to push back on you both before we go to questions, because I know that's where she wants us to go. Listen, this is what I think. I think that because we're out of time as a planet, that we are overcomplicating this issue. And we overcomplicate things when we want to keep them the same. That's my experience. So the arguments that you just made about coal miners, for example, I heard when I said I was going to shut down our aging nuclear power plant, big jobs provider in Vermont. And they said I was being insensitive to putting those hardworking people out of work. And I said, yeah, I am. But just like travel agents, they no longer have a function that is useful to Vermont. And I would argue that coal miners are no longer in an industry that is useful to the planet. And I think it's okay for people to say that. Now, we could give every coal miner in America job retraining, or frankly, write them a check while they went and found new jobs, and the planet would come out ahead, and it wouldn't cost us very much. So my point is, we find huge excuses to keep people the same. When we talk about inequity, and I think Elliot referred that towards the end of his comments, listen, we are in an unequal society in America. The disparity between rich and poor has never been greater. We all know that. But if we're going to let that hold us back from making the simple changes we have to make to solve this problem, I think that we will actually be in a planet that our kids, and definitely our grandkids, will not be able to survive in, not to mention the bats, the bees, and everything else that likes to have oxygen and water and all the other things are going to be confronted. So my point is just a simple one. Let's not make this very complicated. I don't think this is a tough problem to solve. I really don't. I swear to God, if you did the two things I just said, problem solved for America. I don't mean 100% of the problem is solved, but you will have a livable planet if everybody else does the same thing. It's economics. It's about jobs. It's about economic equity. But when you put things in those terms, you don't have the debate about whether it's real or not. You don't have to debate about how hard this is. I did not find it hard to convert our energy system from one that relied on a lot of coal and oil through the electric grid to one that relied on renewables. It actually wasn't hard at all. It was easy. Now, do some Vermonters pissed off that the fields now are filled with solar panels? Yes. Are more Vermonters pissed off that there's windmills on top of our mountains? Yep, they don't like looking at them. But pretty small price to pay for a planet that would be livable. And going back to the EV thing, you're right about inner cities. I mean, you know, we're a rural state. We can't have public transportation get us everywhere. And my point is, on the economics of that, do you know what it costs to run an EV per gallon compared to a gas in Vermont anyway, at our electric rates? Is $1 a gallon. So when people say, well, low-income people can't afford EVs, my point is, no, actually, they can't afford not to. If you can fill up your tank for $1 a gallon instead of $3.95 or $3.40, that's an economic choice that's pretty simple to make. So I just say, you know, let's dig a little deeper. I don't think it's that tough. I don't think it's that hard. And I frankly think we can make 2030 if we get off our butts and do the two things I just said.
I'm itching
Cheer up.
to ask a
Cheer
follow-up
up,
question.
team.
But I want to open it up to the audience. So maybe someone in the audience would like to ask a follow-up question or a new question. It's in the front.
Just to follow up to that, what kind of lobbying pressures did you get from the fossil fuel industry when you were switching or transforming the electric grid?
They want to keep things in place. I think I agree with Elliot, actually, that they're waking up. You know, like Shell Oil now is one of the biggest investors in renewables in the world. You know, the rest of them are going to come along. What Duke just did is really a big deal. That wouldn't have happened even when I was governor just a few years ago. So listen, I don't think we need to I agree. Let's stop villainizing folks. My point is really a simple one. As soon as you can figure out how to make money in any economic transformation, everybody wants in. And I think we're at that point. That's the good news. If you go talk to the folks who invested in solar businesses when I started being governor, you know what they're doing now? They're driving Teslas, not the little cheap ones either. They got the big ones that cost 120 grand. These were a bunch of hippies drinking good Vermont-made beer in the local pub 8 years ago. They're now rich, R-I-C-H. My point is, there's huge economic activity here that everybody sort of got onto. The biggest problem I had was convincing my utilities that they could make more money doing it this way than the old way, And luckily, I had one of the few utilities in America that's run by a woman. I'm not trying to be cute here. It's really true. Because she had bucked so many trends to get where she got, because you go look at utilities in America, just a bunch of old white boys. It really is. And she was willing to think outside the box. Green Mountain Power, Mary Powell. I think, anyone here from the New York Times? No? Oh. Trump won. Anyway, my point is, her brother reports to the New York Times. His name's Powell. My point is, she embraced it. You know what she said? But again, if the national press never asked this question of Green Mountain Power, the biggest utility in Vermont, 80% of our customers go to Green Mountain Power. I don't believe the national press ever asked, how can Green Mountain Power become an energy efficiency company? Do you know what she figured out? She figured out that they pay so much for what we call peak power in New England. And any New England governor can tell you this because we get killed. That means it's really flipping hot, climate change. So everybody turns on their air conditioners in a state that didn't used to air condition, Vermont, Maine, northern New Hampshire, Massachusetts. Good luck down here last summer, right? Or wintertime, climate change. You know, I love it when Trump says, oh, it's warm, it's cold, it's really cold out there. What happened to climate change? He doesn't get the change word, right? But like what's happening tomorrow, what happened yesterday, we get a 40-degree fluctuation all of a sudden. Peak power, come on, you know what we do in New England anyway? We call up all the old dirty generators and we say, turn them on, lots of juice needed when it's really hot, really cold. It's called peak power. It costs us billions to get those folks to rejuice. Mary Powell goes, hey, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm going to tell Vermonters that they can lease a Tesla battery. And when we put solar on their roof, replace their windows and doors, which is what they do, blow the house so deep with cellulose that you got to open the windows in the wintertime to breathe, take out the oil burner in the basement because we're all heating our homes with oil, just like most of Massachusetts, and replace it with a solar field or panel or whatever so that you're totally green. Comfortable house. We use cold weather heat pumps so that it cools you in the summertime, warms you in the wintertime, no more oil being consumed. She figured out that the deal was that she could steal their power, their excess power, during peak power times, and she'd come out ahead as a utility from the old electric model. Now, guess what? If that's true for Green Mountain Power, it's true for every utility, at least in New England. My guess is it's probably true for every utility in America. So my point is, the press has never asked, how the flip do you do this stuff? This should be a national model. All I'm telling you is two things that we did. We pay you what we would ask you to pay. Simple economic concept. Two, we didn't do this in Vermont because the generation wasn't there, but if you simply said, by 2023, 2024, kiss goodbye to the combustion engine, problem solved, huge jobs created. I think it's that simple.
Can I, a different side of that coin and pushing back a little bit. Let's not pretend like there is consensus in corporate America on climate change.
Oh, that's true.
Right? Because if there was, we wouldn't be here. So there are still vested interests, and they're not the ones doing America's Pledge, and they're not the ones working with CTUS. There are still vested interests out there on the fossil fuel side that are funding and fueling, no pun intended, fights around the country, and we fight with them. NRDC fights with them all the time. And so, and it's where I think the fight is actually getting more specific. I think that fight is actually moving away from coal, although coal is still an industry, it's dwindling in power. The next discussion really is going to be on natural gas. That's where the next fight is, partially because in many places where you've seen the reduction in emissions on electricity, it's because people have been switching from coal to natural gas, or they've been switching from dirty oil, particularly in places like New York in the Northwest, Vermont to natural gas. Well, that party is going to be over at some point. And then the continued reduction of carbon emissions, it's got to come from somewhere. And so I think that this fight is manifesting itself in Ohio right now in the state legislature with a bill that was passed that provides subsidies on the natural gas and oil side. It's manifesting itself in Hawaii right now. We're actually very involved in the fight with the natural gas industry there. And so I actually think that will be, over the next 5 years or so, the fight's going to be with the natural gas industry. And you know, I don't really know where they're going to shake out there.
So I'm not sure if you're suggesting that the objective needs to be to shut down the use of natural gas for power as well, and as quickly as possible get to 100% renewable energy. But there are other things we can be doing. I mean, there's a lot of investment going on in carbon capture, for instance. So, you know, one of the things we recommend in here is that by a date certain, any remaining fossil fuel generated power have to capture its emissions or completely offset it with sequestration-based offsets. So I think we have to be open to a broad array of technological solutions. I don't think we can put our eggs all in any one basket. That probably means we need some nuclear power as well, because every time we shut down a nuclear power plant, we're replacing it with natural gas, so our emissions are going up. So I think we need policy approaches that are reasonably technology neutral. It's about the performance. The performance is what matters, getting the emissions down. But I don't think that necessarily means we have to shut down all the natural gas plants if we can, in fact, cost effectively put the carbon capture technology onto them.
Do you think in the long term that we will be a natural gas society?
No, I think it's often described as a transitional fuel, but this is a multi-decade transition. Right? So we talk about carbon neutrality in 2050. That doesn't mean that we are no longer producing emissions. We're still going to be producing emissions. You know, there are some states that are very heavily reliant on heavy industry. There are things like cement production. There are things like steel production, which by virtue of the processes themselves and by virtue of the enormous amounts of heat they need to produce those things, it's going to be really, really hard to convert them into zero emission industries. So we're still going to have emissions in 2050. The challenge is to find ways to counterbalance those emissions. So planting trees, giving farmers incentives to sequester carbon in their soils, and you see investment going on now in direct air capture, including by some of the oil companies. So, you know, again, those things aren't going to be cost effective in the near term, but we need to make them cost effective because we're going to need ways to be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere to counterbalance the emissions that are going to continue.
We'll make sure we get a couple more questions from the audience. Any other, or maybe in the back here? This
is a question for Chris. Which cities are leading in discussions about solutions, but specifically, which ones are putting equity at the forefront of those discussions?
All 25 that I work with, of course. You know, I'm being facetious here, obviously, but I do think that one of the things when they were going through the process of selecting cities to be a part of the American Cities Climate Challenge, one of the things that NRDC and our partners saw was hearing that directly from mayors in nearly every city they went and visited. That being said, I think you're seeing some really interesting examples thinking back to my hometown, Chicago, where there's been a massive increase in transit-oriented development. So really focusing on increasing density around transit stations and now taking that and actually applying it to buses, because we have high-capacity buses in Chicago that carry more people than trains, but also thinking about the equity impact of that and actually going through an evaluation process this year for that. So, you know, doing an appropriate look back in terms of what that work has been like. If you look in the Pacific Northwest, cities like Seattle and Portland have for years staffed in their planning and environmental departments, staff who specifically focus on equity, not only in terms of specifically people of color, but also indigenous communities in those environments as well. And so they're thinking about that work. The city of Denver recently announced that they're creating a climate office. And one of the things, and we're actually, the Climate Challenge is supporting this work to build stakeholder discussions around what that office is going to focus on, what are the first policy pieces they can do, and also how they're bringing communities together. One of the things that we see in the Climate Challenge is that there is a desire, and it's kind of similar to climate change, that there's a desire and focus to focus on issues of equity, but sometimes it's like, how do I do it, right? And that you can create, and thinking, and more broadly to what you were talking about earlier, you can create paralysis because of the nature of the problem. You think it's too far out there, and we try to work with cities to make sure that they don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, and how are they making tangible solutions and tangible steps in the right direction to start focusing on these issues in the right way. I also think that if you're going to actually address these issues, you can't just stop. The world doesn't stop and say, okay, today we're going to stop and we're going to go fix equity, because that's a BS answer, and it's also not responsive to our communities that you got to fix potholes, and you got to pick up garbage, and you still have to do those basic things. Exactly. So the question is, how do you build a plane while flying it? And I think that lots of cities, particularly as it pertains to, we may still be looking at policy solutions. Who's at the table as we build those policy solutions? Who do we make sure has an appropriate voice, so that we're still going towards the larger goal of reducing carbon emissions, but making sure that people feel heard as a part of that. And that sometimes it is those changes and actually starting from a different place, even though the solution may look the same, the process looks and feels more genuine to people.
Can I just quickly add? I mean, one of the reasons I think it's so important that this is happening at the city level, and that you pay attention to what's happening at the city level, is not just because you're delivering tangible solutions there that make a difference and demonstrating the feasibility of these solutions, but the politics tend to be a little less polarized and partisan at the local level. So this is a way of actually depolarizing the issue, and in turn helping to create the kind of we're offering some proof of concept and building a stronger political base for the kind of solutions we're going to need at the national level. So it's a bottom-up approach that is making a difference today, but I also think helping to create the political preconditions for the more structural solutions we're going to need.
We've got, I think, about 5 minutes left, so we'll
be shorter on our answers.
For one quick question, maybe. Chris Russell.
Governor, can you go back to your number about #1 state in solar? What are the qualifiers on that?
I don't know. It's the Union of Concerned Scientists. I don't know what they use, to be honest with you.
No. Well, no. In what way are you saying that Vermont was #1? Because it's not as percent of solar power of total. What was the #1?
Tell you the truth, it's not my statistic. It's from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I don't know what criteria they use to measure it. Does anyone here know that? But we were the #1 solar state for 3 years in a row. I think it's in terms of solar growth per capita, but I could be wrong.
I have a feeling that someone will have to Google that by the time we finish this panel.
Because I've been searching, to try to
Go to the
find
Union of
a way.
Concerned Scientists and ask that's where the statistic comes from.
I'm just saying, but perhaps stating that without qualifying it makes it confusing. If I was a starting out reporter and you said that Vermont's #1 in solar, you said people didn't ask you about it, but.
I didn't say they didn't ask me about it. I said they never asked how.
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously you did quite a bit in that direction, but I'm just not sure about the claim to be #1.
I want to be clear when I say that I should qualify it, but on a panel like this where you've got a timekeeper, you got to be careful. But it's the Union of Concerned Scientists has called Vermont, while I was governor, the #1 solar state in America. Now, I don't know if that's in terms of growth per capita or overall generation. We can find that out, but it is.
Not overall, but maybe growth per
That's
capita.
the problem. You don't have staffers anymore to
Exactly. I used to have thousands of employees that can answer your questions. I'm on my own now, I got to drive my
somewhere
own
in this
car.
room that can settle this.
I got to go through
next
airport
5 minutes.
security, all the rest of the stuff,
All
yeah.
right, I'll look at Union of Concerned Scientists. Thank you.
One last very quick question, right?
Yeah, so this is for you here as well. Despite, the greening of your grid, emissions have ticked up in Vermont, driven largely by the transportation sector in a state where people drive a lot and have an affinity for cars that use a lot of gas. We've talked some about how green projects around transportation operate in cities, but in a state like Vermont, where you have people driving extremely long distances and like their pickup trucks, what do you do?
Do what I said. You mandate that we could do it by 2023. You can't sell combustion engines in America. No different than saying you got to have a catalytic converter in a car. I just don't think it's that tough. And I actually think that this is the problem we have with EVs in Vermont. Because the oil companies and the transportation companies have wanted to stick with what they've got, they haven't developed EVs that are particularly good for cold climates with mud season. It's just fact. Now, because of the pressure they're getting, frankly, from China and other places to produce cars, they're suddenly starting to, Musk is coming out with his first pickup truck. So all this is going to evolve. But my point is, it's much easier to do on the electric grid, which is about half of our climate footprint, than it is in transportation in a rural state. But I'm optimistic that, particularly with some help from the feds, where they mandate this stuff, that we can move to we can move away from the combustion engine much faster than skeptics think. And I think we will. There's going to be a lot of money made from the folks who figure this one out. That's why Ford and General Motors are suddenly getting off their butts and putting all their engineers on it. There's a reason that they're moving as quickly as they are right now.
The power companies don't mind selling you more electricity either, so
exactly.
they're very supportive. But you need to build the infrastructure. You need places for people to charge. So,
right, but that's a cheap problem to solve. That's like saying, for your iPhones, you got to have places to plug in. How long did that take us? My point is, again, we make lots of reasons why this is so complicated. It's just not. That's my view. But you're right. Vermont's got a long way to go on transportation, and that's where we need help from the feds.
So the mark of a good panel is that you end up with more questions than you have time to answer, and I think that's certainly the case here.
Can I just say one thing, because I know we're out of time, but I think we've missed one subject that we can't miss.
Yeah, so I was holding out. I was going to close with one last question.
All right, pop it up.
And so you're speaking to a room full of journalists. You have a captive audience of journalists here. What's the one thing that you would like for them to take away from this panel?
Well, I don't know.
And I feel like I know what
I never tell journalists what to take away. I think what hasn't been mentioned is that I'm an optimist, as you can tell, on our ability to solve this problem. I really am. And I think it will happen much faster. It's kind of like us sitting around going, I'm old enough so that we used to have typewriters when I first started in business, literally, like this, and there were no computers, this thing. If we'd been sitting around debating this as something we really need back 30 years ago, everyone would be like, well, we can't do that. How are we going to get something like this to work like that? Like, what are you talking about? You're a dreamer. We never even heard of that. What do you mean? We didn't even have fax machines. My point is, technology's on our side. The biggest thing we haven't mentioned, I'm just looking at some of the people that don't look like me, age-wise. That's on our side. And that's my biggest hope. If you go, I spend my time when I'm not doing, the other things I do, talking to roomfuls of high school students all over the world. I can go to Saudi Arabia and do this, I can go to China, I can go to Vietnam, I can go to Kentucky, I can go to California. There's a generational divide here, team. And the people that are asking the questions about all the reasons why it can't happen are my age. And the people who are like, how can we get something done here, are my kids' age. And all I'm saying is, there's a whole generation of people, not just in America, but all over the world, that's everybody in that age group, who is like, hey, boomers, me, not okay. We're not going to elect you, we're not going to follow you, we're not going to listen to you, and we're not going to pay attention to you if you keep acting the way you've been. And we're taking over. On this one, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And that's what gives me so much hope. We've been talking to Sea Change about starting at Harvard, a program where we bring high school students in just to teach them the science, how to get stuff done, how to mobilize, how to talk to press, how to make things happen on this issue. But if you look at Greta, if you look at all of the generation that's coming up and bubbling up, they aren't going to tolerate us going, well, in 2050, we ought to, you know? So my point is, I think the generational thing is really important here. Let's not miss it. And I know the press isn't missing it, but that should also give us hope.
Chris?
Yeah, two things. One, understand there is someone working on climate change in every city hall in America. They may not call it that. They may not be the chief sustainability officer. They may just be the director of public works. They may be the person who does the energy procurement for the city. They may be the transportation commissioner. But there is someone working and thinking about these issues in every city hall in America. Secondly, I would be wary of making sure that I would make sure that we are telling stories not just on the coast. I spent 7 years in City Hall in Chicago. We did a lot of great things. There's a lot of wonderful work happening in Evanston, Illinois, and there's a lot of wonderful work happening in Columbus, Ohio, and there's really good things happening with the new mayor in Kansas City, Missouri. San Antonio, Texas, I think has one of the best mayors on climate change in the country. So there are stories to be told, and they're not just in New York, San Francisco, LA, Seattle, and Portland. And so the opportunities to tell those stories and amplify those voices as well, I think are going to be critical. I think about from an advocacy standpoint, because if those cities aren't a part of this, you don't build political momentum for given the gravity of the challenge and the folks that have to be brought along in the conversation.
Good point.
So I would say focus on solutions. Don't fall prey to stereotypes and narratives. And be mindful of your credibility, because it's really important that you be able to reach the people we need to be able to reach, not just the ones who are already coming along, but the ones who need to be brought along. And you know, we're counting on you for that.
Thank you so much, Elliot, Chris, Governor Shumlin.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you all for